Mom and Dad think it's best if you don't come to the funeral. You know how you are. We need to maintain a certain image for Grandma's friends and Dad's business associates. Just stay home. I stared at the text message from my sister Emma, reading it 3 times before my hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. The funeral was tomorrow. Grandma Rose's funeral. And my own family was telling me not to come. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, each one a small knife, cutting deeper into wounds I didn't even know I still had. I was 32 years old, a licensed clinical social worker with a master's degree from State University, and I was being told I was too embarrassing to mourn my own grandmother. The grandmother who had partially raised me after my parents' divorce when I was 12, who had been there for every scraped knee and broken heart when my mother was too busy navigating her new marriage to wealthy businessman George Caldwell, and my father was too occupied with his new wife Patricia and her family money. Grandma Rose had been my constant, my safe harbor in the storm of my family's transformation from comfortable middle class to obsessively, suffocatingly wealthy. She never cared that I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door, or that my apartment was in an unfashionable neighborhood on the south side of town where the rent was actually affordable on a social worker's salary of $43,000 a year. She never once looked at me with the mixture of pity and contempt that I saw in my father Richard's eyes at family gatherings, or the barely concealed disdain that my sister Emma radiated whenever I showed up in my department store clothes while she wore her designer labels like armor. My brother Marcus usually just avoided looking at me altogether, following whatever lead our parents set, the perpetual middle child who never wanted to rock the boat. They had all become strangers to me over the past 20 years, morphing into people I barely recognized, people who measured worth in dollar signs and social connections, who introduced themselves by listing their country club memberships and vacation properties. And now they were telling me I couldn't say goodbye to the one person who had always loved me exactly as I was. I sat on my secondhand couch in my small living room, still wearing my work clothes from the crisis intervention I'd done that afternoon, with a family facing eviction, and I felt something crack open inside my chest. Grandma Rose had died 4 days ago, peacefully in her sleep at Meadowbrook Nursing Home, at the age of 87, and I had learned about it from a Facebook post Emma had made, not even a phone call, just a carefully curated announcement with a filtered photo and a caption about celebrating a life well lived. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. I hadn't always been the family embarrassment. Growing up, we were solidly middle class, the kind of family that took vacations to the beach in a minivan packed with coolers and beach toys, who ate dinner together most nights around a table that had seen better days, who measured success in report cards and soccer trophies rather than stock portfolios and property values. My father Richard had been a regional sales manager for an office supply company, making decent money but nothing extravagant, and my mother Linda had worked part-time as a dental hygienist, her income supplementing the family budget enough that we could afford things like braces and summer camp. Then came the divorce when I was 12, a bitter and protracted thing that I never fully understood, because both my parents refused to explain it in terms beyond "we grew apart," and sometimes these things happen. What I did understand was that within 11 months of the divorce being finalized, my father had married Patricia Worthington, a woman whose family owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across 3 states, and whose idea of casual entertaining involved catered affairs for 30 people. 6 months after that, my mother married George Caldwell, who had made his fortune in commercial real estate development and lived in a house that had its own name, Windmere Estate, like it was some kind of English manor instead of a McMansion in suburban Connecticut. Both sides of my family suddenly and simultaneously became obsessed with wealth, status, image, and all the trappings of money they'd never had before. My sister Emma, who was 16 when the divorce happened, adapted instantly, transforming from a girl who wore thrift store band t-shirts to someone who spoke fluently in designer labels and whose entire personality seemed to reorganize itself around being seen in the right places with the right people. My brother Marcus, 14 at the time, became quieter and more careful, learning to navigate the new expectations by simply agreeing with whoever held the power in any given moment, never making waves, never expressing opinions that might contradict what our parents wanted to hear. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't pretend that the new money made us better people, couldn't fake enthusiasm for country club luncheons and charity galas that were really just excuses for wealthy people to show off their wealth to other wealthy people. When it came time for college, I chose social work as my major, drawn to it after volunteering at a homeless shelter during my senior year of high school, and the disappointment from both sides of my family was palpable and immediate. Throughout those 5 years, while the rest of my family was being absorbed into their new wealthy existence, I visited Grandma Rose every single Tuesday evening at Meadowbrook Nursing Home, a routine that started the first week she moved in and continued, without fail for 5 years, 260 weeks of showing up with butterscotch candies and stories from my work, and genuine interest in hearing her talk about her life, her late husband, her memories. My father visited her maybe 10 times total in those 5 years. Emma came 7 times, always rushed, always checking her phone. Marcus only appeared when our parents made him come for major holidays. But they loved to mock me for the life I'd chosen. Last 4th of July, at my father and Patricia's house with its circular driveway and 3-car garage, Emma had laughed openly when I pulled up in my Honda Civic, with its dented passenger door and faded paint, saying loudly enough for everyone on the patio to hear, "Oh my God, Sarah, are you still driving that thing? I think my gardener has a nicer car." The moments of casual cruelty had accumulated over the years like layers of sediment, each one building on the last, until I could barely remember what it felt like to sit at a family gathering without that tight knot of anxiety in my stomach. Last Thanksgiving at Patricia's house, the one with the professionally decorated interior that looked like it had been lifted from a design magazine, complete with the perfectly coordinated fall color scheme of burnt orange and gold, my father Richard had asked me in front of everyone assembled around the extended dining table that seated 16, "Sarah, when are you going to get a real job that actually pays? You've got a master's degree, for God's sake. You're 32 years old and you're barely making more than someone working retail." His tone had been light, almost joking, but the contempt underneath was unmistakable, and Patricia had laughed that tinkling laugh of hers and said something about how some people just aren't motivated by success, while my mother Linda, sitting at the opposite end of the table next to George, had looked down at her plate and said nothing at all in my defense. Then there was Christmas, just 8 months ago, when we'd gathered at my mother's house, Windmere Estate with its grand foyer and double staircase, and we'd done the gift exchange that had become increasingly painful for me each year as I watched everyone else open expensive presents while trying to hide how much thought and care I'd put into the modest gifts I could afford on my salary. Emma had handed me a small envelope with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and when I opened it in front of everyone, it was a $50 gift card to a discount department store, the kind of place that sold everything from groceries to clothing at bargain prices. And she'd said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I figured that's probably all you can afford to shop at anyway, so at least this way you can get yourself something nice." The laughter that followed had been uncomfortable, uncertain, but no one had told her it was inappropriate, no one had defended me, and I'd smiled and thanked her because what else could I do without being accused of causing a scene, or being too sensitive or not being able to take a joke. Marcus's wedding 2 years ago had been perhaps the most visually obvious example of where I stood in the family hierarchy. Because despite being immediate family, despite being the groom's sister, I had been seated at a table in the back of the reception hall with distant cousins I'd met maybe twice in my life and family friends I didn't know at all, While Emma had been at the head table in her role as maid of honor, and our parents had been seated at the table directly adjacent to the wedding party, positions of prominence that made it crystal clear who mattered and who didn't. But through all of it, through every slight and every moment of dismissal, and every gathering where I felt like a stranger in my own family, Grandma Rose had been my refuge, and my reminder that I wasn't crazy, that the way they treated me wasn't normal or acceptable. Her room at Meadowbrook, a modest space with cream-colored walls and a window that looked out onto the garden courtyard, was covered with evidence of my work. Thank you cards from families I'd helped find housing or navigate the social services system, letters from clients whose children I'd advocated for in school meetings, photos of kids I'd worked with who'd graduated high school or gotten their first jobs. She displayed them all proudly on her bulletin board and on her dresser and taped to the wall beside her bed, and whenever anyone from the family did bother to visit, she'd point to them and say, "That's my granddaughter Sarah's work. She changes people's lives." And I knew it embarrassed my father and annoyed Emma because it highlighted the difference between what they valued and what actually mattered. My last visit with Grandma Rose happened on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks before she passed, and I remember every detail of it with the kind of crystal clarity that only comes with hindsight, the way ordinary moments become precious when you realize they were the last of their kind. I'd stopped at the small bakery she loved on the way to Meadowbrook, picking up 2 of the lemon cookies she'd been asking for, and when I arrived at her room around 6:30, she was sitting in her armchair by the window in her blue cardigan, the one with the buttons shaped like flowers that I'd given her 2 Christmases ago, looking out at the courtyard garden where the late September light was turning everything gold. She was 87 years old by then, and the years had made her smaller somehow, more delicate, her hands thin and spotted with age, her hair completely white and fine as spider webs, but her eyes were still sharp and clear, that particular shade of hazel that caught the light and seemed to see right through to the truth of things. "There's my girl," she'd said when I walked in, and her smile had been genuine and warm, the kind of welcome I never got from anyone else in my family. And we'd sat together eating the lemon cookies and drinking the terrible coffee from the nursing home's communal pot, while I told her about my week, about the family of 4 I'd helped get into transitional housing after 3 months in their car, about the teenager I was working with who'd finally agreed to go back to school, about all the small victories and frustrations that made up my work. She'd listened the way she always did, asking questions and nodding and making those small sounds of understanding that told me she was really hearing what I said, not just waiting for her turn to talk. And then she'd gone quiet for a moment, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between sadness and determination, and she'd reached over to take my hand in both of hers, her skin papery and warm, and said, "Sarah, I want you to know I've taken care of things. I've made sure you'll be all right." I hadn't understood what she meant, had assumed she was talking about some small bequest, maybe her jewelry box or her collection of recipe cards, and I'd squeezed her hand and said something reassuring about how I was already all right, how she didn't need to worry about me, and she'd shaken her head slowly and said, "No, listen to me. Keep being exactly who you are. Don't let them change you. Don't let them make you feel less than you are. You have more worth in your little finger than the rest of them have in their whole bodies, and I need you to remember that." I'd thought it was just elderly rambling, the kind of thing old people say when they're thinking about mortality, and I'd promised I'd remember, and we'd moved on to talking about other things. And when I'd left that evening, she'd hugged me tighter than usual and told me she loved me 3 times. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning while I was in a meeting with a client's school counselor, Grandma Rose died peacefully in her sleep, her heart simply stopping during her afternoon nap. And I found out about it not from a phone call or a text message from family, but from a Facebook post that Emma had made, a carefully curated photo of Grandma from 20 years ago, with a caption about celebrating the life of a remarkable woman and a string of crying emojis. The notification had popped up on my phone during my lunch break, and I'd stared at it in my car in the agency parking lot, not quite believing what I was reading, waiting for someone to call me, to include me, to acknowledge that I was family too. No one called. The grief hit me in waves, but it was compounded by something worse than sadness. A deep and bitter hurt that my family couldn't even be bothered to tell me directly that the person I'd loved most in the world was gone. Then, the day before the funeral, my phone had buzzed with a text message from Emma, and when I'd opened it, the words had been like a physical blow to my chest. Mom and Dad think it's best if you don't come to the funeral. You know how you are. We need to maintain a certain image for Grandma's friends and Dad's business associates. Just stay home. The devastation hit me in stages, each one worse than the last, like waves that kept pulling me under just when I thought I'd found my footing. The first wave was the text itself, those casual words that told me I wasn't wanted at my own grandmother's funeral, that my presence would be an embarrassment, that maintaining an image for business associates mattered more than my grief. The second wave came when I realized no one else had disagreed with this decision, that somewhere in a family discussion I hadn't been part of, they'd all agreed that excluding me was the right choice, and not one person had spoken up for me or thought that maybe, just maybe, I deserved to say goodbye to the woman who'd loved me most in this world. I called in sick to work the next day, which I never did. My supervisor, Karen, expressing immediate concern because in 4 years at the agency, I'd never taken an unscheduled day off, and I couldn't even explain it to her properly, just said there was a family emergency and I needed a couple of days. I spent those 48 hours alone in my small apartment, the one-bedroom place in the older building that Emma had made fun of more than once, crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child, the kind of sobbing that leaves you exhausted and hollow. My best friend Jessica from college, who now lived across town working as a teacher, came over on the evening before the funeral with takeout food I couldn't eat and just sat with me on my worn couch, holding my hand while I tried to explain through tears how it felt to be deemed too embarrassing to mourn, how the exclusion hurt almost as much as the loss itself. She was furious on my behalf, wanted me to show up anyway, to force them to acknowledge me. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't face the scene that would cause, couldn't bear the thought of them looking at me with that mixture of annoyance and contempt while I tried to grieve. So on the day of Grandma Rose's funeral, a crisp October Saturday, when the maple trees were blazing golden red, I went instead to Riverside Park, the place where Grandma used to take me when I was young, where we'd feed the ducks and sit on the bench overlooking the water and talk about everything and nothing. I brought flowers, white roses, because those had been her favorite, and I sat on our old bench and had my own memorial service, just me and my memories, and the sound of the water and the autumn wind. I told her out loud how much I loved her, how much I'd miss our Tuesday evenings, how grateful I was for every moment she'd made me feel valued and seen and worthy. I cried there too, but it was cleaner somehow, more honest than crying in my apartment had been. And when I finally left as the sun was setting, I felt like I'd at least honored her properly, even if I'd had to do it alone. 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, my doorbell rang and, when I answered it, a courier handed me a certified letter requiring my signature, the kind of official correspondence that immediately makes your heart beat faster. The return address read Whitmore and Associates, Attorneys at Law, with an address in the downtown business district, and when I opened it with shaking hands, the letterhead was heavy cream-colored paper with embossed lettering that spoke of expense and prestige. The letter was formal and brief, requesting my presence at the reading of the last will and testament of Rose Eleanor Matthews, scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then came the line that made me read it 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. Your attendance is mandatory as a named beneficiary. I stared at those words until they blurred, wondering what Grandma could possibly have left me, assuming it would be something small and sentimental, maybe her jewelry box with the paste pearls she used to let me play with as a child, or perhaps the photo albums that chronicled our family history that no one else would want. But at least it was something. At least it meant she'd thought of me, that I'd mattered enough to be remembered in her final wishes. The confusion that followed the certified letter was its own particular kind of anxiety, a uncertainty that kept me up at night wondering what Grandma Rose could have possibly left me and why a prestigious law firm was involved in what I assumed would be a simple bequest of costume jewelry or maybe her collection of photo albums that documented family history no one else seemed to care about. I kept reading that phrase, mandatory as named beneficiary, and trying to parse what it meant, whether it was standard legal language or something more significant. But I had no frame of reference for any of this. The family group chat, which typically sat silent for weeks at a time, except when someone needed to coordinate holiday plans or share links to articles about their accomplishments, suddenly exploded with activity on Wednesday morning, 2 days after I'd received the letter. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages, and when I finally looked at it during my lunch break, I saw that my father had sent a message to the whole family demanding to know why I had been summoned to a will reading. His tone aggressive and accusatory as if I'd orchestrated the whole thing somehow. Emma had chimed in quickly. "It's probably just a formality. Some old jewelry or something. Don't make it into a big deal." Then, an hour later, a private message just to me. "You better not cause a scene at this thing. Just take whatever trinket Grandma left you and go. This is a formality." I stared at that message for a long time, feeling the familiar sting of being treated like a problem, like my very existence was an inconvenience they had to manage. And I didn't respond because I honestly didn't know what to say, and because some part of me was tired of defending myself to people who had already decided I wasn't worth their respect. Instead, that evening after work, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and searched for Whitmore and Associates, clicking through to their website and feeling my eyebrows rise as I took in the sleek professional design, the list of senior partners with their impressive credentials, the practice areas that included estate planning, but also corporate law and wealth management. This wasn't the kind of firm you hired to distribute grandmother's costume jewelry. This was the kind of firm that charged $500 an hour and handled estates worth substantial amounts, the kind of firm that people like my father and his business associates would use. I clicked through several pages, reading about James Whitmore himself, the senior partner whose name was on the letter I'd received, and learned that he'd been practicing estate law for 35 years, had been recognized by multiple legal associations, had written articles for law journals about complex estate planning. The growing sense that something unexpected was coming settled over me like a weight. Not quite hope, because I'd learned not to hope for too much where my family was concerned, but a strange anticipation that made my hands shake slightly as I closed my laptop and tried to prepare myself for whatever Tuesday would bring, knowing that in some fundamental way, nothing was going to be quite what I expected. Tuesday arrived with the kind of crisp November weather that makes everything feel slightly unreal, the sky too blue and the air too sharp, and I stood in front of my closet for 20 minutes, trying to decide what to wear to a will reading, finally settling on my best professional outfit, a charcoal gray suit I'd bought 3 years ago for court appearances when I had to testify as a caseworker, paired with a simple white blouse and the only pair of heels I owned that weren't scuffed beyond repair. The outfit was modest but dignified, nothing that would draw attention or give anyone ammunition to criticize me, though I knew from experience that my family would find something to comment on regardless of what I wore. I left my apartment an hour early because I couldn't stand the waiting anymore, drove my 10-year-old Honda Civic downtown to the business district where glass towers reflected the autumn sun, and everyone on the sidewalks wore clothes that cost more than my monthly rent. The offices of Whitmore and Associates occupied the 14th and 15th floors of one of the newer buildings, all polished marble and brass fixtures in the lobby, and I gave my name to the security desk with hands that trembled slightly as I signed the visitor log. When I stepped off the elevator at exactly 2 o'clock, having spent 15 minutes in the building's coffee shop downstairs trying to calm my racing heart, the receptionist directed me to a conference room down a hallway lined with oil paintings of what I assumed were the firm's founding partners. I could hear voices before I reached the open door, familiar voices that made my stomach clench with anxiety and old hurt. And when I stepped into the conference room, I saw that my entire family had arrived before me, all of them already seated around the long mahogany table, like they were holding court. My father Richard sat at the head closest to the door, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, wearing a suit that probably cost $3,000, and beside him sat my stepmother Patricia in a cream-colored designer dress with pearls at her throat, both of them looking like they'd just stepped out of a country club luncheon. On the other side of the table sat my mother Linda with her husband George, my mother's blonde hair swept up in an elegant twist, George looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit like he always did at formal occasions, and next to them were Emma and her husband Brad, Emma wearing black Chanel that she'd probably bought specifically for Grandma's funeral, and Marcus with his fiancée Amber, who I'd only met twice, and who looked at me now with the kind of polite confusion that suggested Emma had been talking about me before I arrived. They all turned when I entered, and I watched Emma lean over to whisper something to Brad, both of them smiling in a way that made my face burn with familiar shame. And I was about to take the empty seat at the far end of the table, as far from everyone as possible, when the door behind me opened again and a distinguished man of about 60 entered. His silver hair impeccably groomed, wearing a navy suit and carrying a leather portfolio that looked like it had cost more than my car. He surveyed the room with the kind of practiced calm that comes from decades of dealing with family drama, introduced himself as James Whitmore, in a voice that was both warm and authoritative, and then, while my entire family watched in visible surprise, he walked directly to me, extended his hand, and shook mine with a warmth and respect that I hadn't experienced from anyone in this room in years. Attorney Whitmore settled into his chair at the opposite end of the conference table with the kind of measured composure that suggested he'd presided over countless family meetings just like this one, though I suspected most of them hadn't carried quite the same undercurrent of tension that filled this particular room. And he opened the leather portfolio he'd been carrying to reveal a thick document with blue backing, the formal last will and testament of Rose Eleanor Matthews, my grandmother, the woman who had raised me through some of the hardest years of my childhood, and who had remained the one constant source of unconditional love in my life, even as everyone else in this room had gradually decided I wasn't worth their time or respect. Whitmore began with what I assumed was standard legal language, his voice professional and clear as he established for the record that we were gathered on November 14th for the reading of the will, that all parties named in the document had been notified and were present, and then he said something that made me sit up slightly straighter in my chair. Mrs. Matthews created this will 6 months ago, on May 3rd of this year, with full legal counsel, updating and replacing all previous versions of her testamentary documents. 6 months ago, that would have been early May, just after Mother's Day, a holiday that my father and Emma had forgotten entirely while I'd brought Grandma Rose to the botanical gardens she loved, pushing her wheelchair through paths lined with spring flowers while she told me stories about my grandfather and squeezed my hand with her papery fingers. Whitmore continued, his tone taking on a slightly more formal quality. I want to establish for the record that Mrs. Matthews was evaluated by 2 independent physicians as part of the will creation process, both of whom assessed her mental capacity and found her to be of completely sound mind, with no evidence of dementia, undue influence, or diminished capacity. I noticed my father shift in his seat at this, his expression suggesting he was already thinking about legal challenges, already planning how to contest whatever was coming. And I felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach, because even now, even at the reading of our grandmother's will, there was going to be conflict and argument, and someone deciding that the rules didn't apply to them. The attorney moved through some smaller bequests first, items that seemed almost perfunctory in the way he read them. Grandma's china set, the one with the delicate pink roses that she'd inherited from her own mother, was left to St. Augustine's Church where she'd been a member for 40 years, and there was $5,000 designated for Evergreen Nursing Home where she'd spent her final 2 years. specifically earmarked for their activities and recreation budget, and various personal items were distributed to friends and distant relatives, nothing that seemed particularly significant or valuable. My family looked almost bored during this part, Emma examining her manicure and my father checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be, and I felt myself starting to relax slightly, thinking that maybe this would be quick and painless, that I'd receive whatever small token Grandma had left me, and then I could leave and never have to sit in a room with all of these people again. Then Whitmore paused, set down the page he'd been reading from, and looked directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something that might have been sympathy or respect or perhaps both. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room suddenly pay attention. The remainder of the estate concerns the bulk of Mrs. Rose Eleanor Matthews's assets, which total approximately $2.7 million, including property, investments, and liquid assets. The silence that followed was absolute. My heart began to pound so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I watched as my father sat up straighter, as Patricia's hand flew to her pearl necklace, as Emma's eyes went wide, and Marcus leaned forward in his chair, all of them suddenly very, very interested in what the attorney had to say next. Whitmore looked down at the document in front of him, and when he began to read again, his voice carried the weight of my grandmother's final wishes, words that she had chosen with deliberate care, and that were about to change everything I thought I understood about my place in this family. To my granddaughter, Sarah Elizabeth Matthews, who was the only member of my family to treat me like a human being rather than an obligation, who visited me every single week without fail, who held my hand and listened to my stories, who never once asked me for money or looked at her watch impatiently, who brought light into my final years, when everyone else was too busy climbing social ladders to remember I existed. To Sarah, I leave my house at 847 Maple Drive, the home where I lived for 43 years, and where some of my happiest memories were made, along with all furnishings and personal property contained therein. I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was hearing, because Grandma's house was a beautiful 3-bedroom craftsman in one of the older, established neighborhoods, worth at least $400,000, and I had assumed it would go to my father as the oldest child, had never even considered that she might leave it to me. But Whitmore wasn't finished reading. I further leave to Sarah my investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $1.8 million, held in accounts at Merrill Lynch and managed by Davidson Financial Services, along with my savings accounts at First National Bank and Cornerstone Credit Union, which together total $850,000, and any other financial assets or accounts in my name at the time of my death. The numbers didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, because that was $2.6 million, nearly the entire estate, and I felt dizzy and disconnected from my body, as Whitmore concluded. All remaining personal property, including my jewelry, photographs, books, and any items not specifically bequeathed to other parties, I also leave to Sarah, with the hope that she will treasure the memories they represent as much as I treasured every moment she spent with me. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, could hear Patricia's sharp intake of breath, could hear the rustle of fabric as my father shifted in his chair, and then everyone started talking at once, voices rising in protest and disbelief and anger, Emma saying, "What? That can't be right," and Marcus saying, "This has to be a mistake," and my father's voice cutting through, all of them, loud and demanding, "Let me see that document." But I just sat there frozen, unable to speak or move or do anything except stare at Attorney Whitmore, who was looking back at me with an expression of quiet satisfaction, like he had been waiting for this moment and was pleased to see my family's carefully constructed facade of civility finally crumble. My hands were shaking so badly I had to clasp them together in my lap, and I realized with a strange detachment that I was probably in shock, that my brain simply couldn't process the reality that my grandmother, who had lived so modestly in that nursing home, and who I had loved simply because she was Grandma, had been wealthy, had chosen to leave almost everything to me, had seen me and valued me in a way that no one else in this room ever had. And even as my family erupted in chaos around me, arguing and protesting and demanding explanations, I felt something crack open inside my chest, some tight knot of pain and shame that had lived there for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. My father was on his feet before Whitmore had even finished speaking, his chair scraping back against the polished floor with a harsh sound that made me flinch, and his voice was loud and sharp with the kind of authority he used in boardrooms when he expected people to fall in line with whatever he demanded. "This is ridiculous. She was senile. This will can't be valid." But Whitmore didn't even blink, didn't show any sign of being intimidated by my father's bluster, and his response was calm and measured in a way that suggested he'd dealt with plenty of angry family members before and knew exactly how to handle them. "As I mentioned, Mr. Matthews, your mother was evaluated by two independent physicians during the will creation process, Dr. Helen Cartwright, a geriatric psychiatrist with 30 years of experience, and Dr. Robert Chen, a neurologist who specializes in cognitive assessment. And both doctors found her to be of completely sound mind, with no evidence whatsoever of dementia, diminished capacity, or any condition that would impair her judgment." My father's face was turning red, that particular shade that meant he was getting truly angry rather than just annoyed. But Marcus spoke up before he could respond, his voice carrying a note of almost desperate confusion. "But we're her family too. Why would she do this? Why would she leave everything to Sarah and practically nothing to the rest of us?" Whitmore looked down at the document again, and I could see something shift in his expression, a kind of satisfaction that suggested he'd been waiting to read this next part. Mrs. Matthews actually addressed that question directly in her will, and I quote, "I am making this decision with full awareness that other family members may contest this, and I want it known that my choice is deliberate and made after careful consideration, and I want the following statement read aloud, so that there can be no misunderstanding about my intentions. Sarah has shown me more genuine love in 5 years than the rest of my family showed in 20, and this is not a punishment to the others, so much as it is a recognition of the one person who treated me like I still mattered." The words hung in the air like an indictment, and I saw Emma's face crumble, saw her eyes fill with tears that I knew were more anger than sadness, and when she spoke, her voice was shaking. "This isn't fair. We have expenses. We have lives to maintain. We have costs that Sarah doesn't understand because she's never had to worry about keeping up appearances or maintaining a certain standard." I felt something cold settle in my chest at that, at the implication that my lack of wealth meant I couldn't possibly understand real problems. But before I could respond, Patricia leaned forward in her chair and pointed one perfectly manicured finger at me, her voice dripping with contempt. "You manipulated an old woman. You probably spent all that time with her whispering poison about the rest of us, making yourself look like some kind of saint, while you convinced her to cut out her real family." The accusation hung in the air like poison, and I felt something inside me shift. Something that had been bent and suppressed for years, suddenly straightening. And when I spoke, my voice was shaking. But it was there, audible, mine. "I never asked Grandma for anything. I visited her because I loved her." The words came out stronger than I expected, and I saw Patricia's eyes narrow, but I kept going because suddenly I had so much to say, so many years of silence to break. I didn't even know she had money. She lived in a nursing home, wore the same 5 outfits, ate the cafeteria food. I brought her butterscotch candies that cost $3 at the drugstore because they made her smile. That's manipulation? My father started to speak, but Whitmore raised one hand in a gesture that commanded immediate silence, and his voice carried an authority that even my father couldn't override. "I think everyone needs to take a breath." Mrs. Matthews anticipated that there would be strong emotions, and she left something that I believe will provide necessary context. He reached into the folder in front of him and pulled out several sealed envelopes, cream-colored and expensive-looking, each one labeled with a name in my grandmother's careful handwriting. Mrs. Matthews also left letters for each family member. She requested that these be read here, in this setting, so that everyone would understand her reasoning. He began distributing the envelopes, and I watched my family members take them with expressions ranging from suspicion to something that looked almost like fear. And when Whitmore held one out to me, I took it with trembling hands and saw my name written across the front, in the familiar script that I'd seen on birthday cards and Christmas notes for my entire life. Whitmore looked at me with gentle inquiry. "Sarah, would you like me to read yours aloud, or would you prefer to read it privately?" I thought about keeping it to myself, about protecting these final words from my grandmother, from the people who were already trying to tear apart her last wishes. But then I realized that maybe they needed to hear this. Maybe I needed them to hear it, and I nodded. "You can read it." Whitmore opened the envelope carefully, unfolded the single sheet of paper inside, and began to read in that same measured, professional voice that somehow made my grandmother's words even more powerful. "My dearest Sarah, if you're hearing this, then I've passed on, and I hope my death was peaceful and didn't cause you too much grief, though knowing your tender heart, I suspect you cried for me, and I'm sorry for that, even though I know it means you loved me. I want you to know that every single Tuesday evening you spent with me was a gift. Every story you listened to, even when you'd heard it before. Every time you held my hand or brought me those butterscotch candies I loved, or showed me pictures of the families you'd helped through your work. You treated me like I still had value, like my stories mattered, like I was still a person, and not just an old woman warehoused away from the real world." I was crying before he'd finished the first paragraph, tears streaming down my face that I didn't bother to wipe away, and Whitmore continued, "This money I'm leaving you isn't payment for your time, because your time was freely given out of love, and you can't put a price on that. This money is to free you from ever having to apologize for choosing meaning over money, for choosing compassion over status, for being exactly the person I raised you to be even when others couldn't see your worth." Whitmore set my letter down carefully and looked around the room at the other envelopes still clutched in various hands, and his voice was gentle, but there was something almost challenging in it when he asked, "Would anyone else like their letter read aloud?" My father's response was immediate and sharp, his voice carrying a note of almost defensive anger as he said, "That won't be necessary." But even as he spoke, he was tearing open his envelope with movements that were too rough and too fast. And I watched his eyes move across the page and saw his face go from red to something closer to purple. Saw his jaw clench so tightly I thought I could hear his teeth grinding together from across the table. And I didn't need to see the words to know what my grandmother had written, because I could imagine her careful documentation of every missed visit, every phone call that never came, every time he'd promised to visit and then canceled at the last minute because something more important had come up, and I remembered her face on those days when she'd been expecting him and he hadn't shown, remembered how she'd try to hide her disappointment and make excuses about how busy he must be. Emma had opened her letter too, and I watched the color drain from her face as she read, watched her hand come up to cover her mouth, and when she looked up at me there was something raw in her eyes that might have been shame or might have been anger at being forced to confront the truth of her own neglect. And Whitmore said quietly, almost conversationally, "Mrs. Matthews kept very detailed records. In your letter, Emma, she noted that you visited 7 times in 5 years, and that each visit lasted less than 30 minutes, and that during every single visit, you spent more time looking at your phone than talking to her." Emma's face crumpled, and she looked like she might argue, but no words came out, and Marcus had gone very still in his chair, his unopened letter sitting on the table in front of him like something dangerous. And when he finally picked it up and read it, I saw his shoulders slump in a way that made him look suddenly younger and smaller. And Whitmore continued, "She noted, Marcus, that you never visited alone, that you only came when your parents made you come, and that you never really spoke to her, never asked about her life or her memories, just sat there checking the time until it was acceptable to leave. Marcus didn't look up, just stared at the letter in his hands, and I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness, because this wasn't how I'd wanted things to be. I'd never wanted my grandmother to feel so abandoned by her own family. I'd just wanted them to care about her the way I did. Patricia had opened her letter with an expression that suggested she was prepared to be unimpressed by whatever an old woman had written about her. But I saw something flicker across her face as she read, something that might have been surprise or discomfort. And my mother Linda was crying silently as she read her own letter, tears streaming down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. And my stepfather George had put his arm around her shoulders and was reading over her shoulder with an expression of genuine remorse that made him look older than I'd ever seen him. The truth was laid bare in my grandmother's careful handwriting, all the broken promises and forgotten birthdays and visits that never happened. 5 years of detailed observation from a woman who'd had nothing to do but sit in her nursing home room and notice who came and who didn't, who stayed and who couldn't wait to leave, who loved her and who just felt obligated. The silence in the room had become something dense and suffocating, filled with the sound of rustling paper and suppressed breathing. And then my mother Linda spoke for the first time since the reading had begun, her voice quiet but clear in a way that made everyone turn to look at her. She's right. Rose was right about all of it. I saw my father's head snap toward her with an expression of absolute betrayal, but my mother kept talking, her words coming faster as if she'd been holding them back for years and couldn't contain them anymore. We all got too caught up in the new money, the new status, the new lives we built. We forgot what actually mattered. We forgot about Rose, forgot about being decent human beings, forgot about Sarah. She looked directly at me, and her eyes were red-rimmed and genuine. Your grandmother was a better person than any of us in this room, and she saw clearly what we refused to see. My stepfather George nodded slowly beside her, his face carrying a weight of shame that made him look older than his 60 years, and he said quietly, "She's not wrong. I went along with all of it. Never questioned whether we were treating you fairly, Sarah. Never thought about how Rose must have felt sitting in that nursing home waiting for visits that never came." But my father Richard was already shaking his head, his face still that dangerous shade of red that I associated with his worst moods, and his voice when he spoke was tight with barely controlled anger. "This is insane. I don't care what Rose wrote in her letters or how guilty the rest of you suddenly feel. This will is the result of manipulation and undue influence, and we'll contest it. We'll prove she was coerced, that Sarah took advantage of an elderly woman's loneliness." Whitmore's response was immediate, and his tone carried an edge I hadn't heard before, something sharp beneath the professional courtesy. "You're welcome to try, Mr. Matthews." Mrs. Matthews anticipated exactly this response, which is why she was extraordinarily thorough in documenting her wishes and her mental state. He reached into his folder again and pulled out what looked like a flash drive, holding it up so everyone could see it. She recorded video testimony with me present, time-stamped and witnessed, by 2 additional attorneys and a notary public. She answered extensive questions about her relationship with each family member, cited specific examples of visits and lack thereof, and articulated her reasoning with perfect clarity. The recordings were made over 3 separate sessions spanning 2 months, precisely to demonstrate that her decision was consistent and carefully considered, not the result of any momentary anger or confusion. He set the flash drive on the table with a small, definitive click. She discussed her cognitive function, volunteered to be evaluated by independent physicians, and cooperated fully with psychological testing to ensure no one could question her capacity. She was evaluated by Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a geriatric psychiatrist, and Dr. Michael Chen, a neurologist, both of whom found her to be of completely sound mind, with no signs of dementia, cognitive impairment, or susceptibility to undue influence. Whitmore looked directly at my father with something in his eyes that might have been contempt barely masked by professional dignity. "Your mother knew you would react exactly this way, Mr. Matthews. She planned for it. Then he turned to me and his expression softened into something almost protective. She wanted to protect you from having to fight for what she wanted you to have, Sarah. She did everything possible to make this ironclad. Emma was the first to shift her approach, and I watched it happen in real time. Watched her face change from shock to calculation as she seemed to realize that no amount of legal maneuvering was going to undo what my grandmother had done. And when she spoke, her voice had taken on a softer quality that I recognized from childhood as her please forgive me tone. Sarah, come on, we're family. You can't just take everything and walk away from us. Think about sharing, think about what's fair. The word fair coming from her mouth after everything that had happened felt like a slap, and I felt something shift inside me, something that had been bent and accommodating for so many years, suddenly straightening into something stronger, and when I spoke, my voice was shaking, but there was steel underneath it that I'd never heard before. Like you thought about including me in Grandma's funeral? Like you thought about fairness when you told me I was too embarrassing to mourn with my own family? Emma's face flushed a deep red and she looked away, her hands twisting together in her lap, and I saw Brad put his hand on her arm as if to calm her, or maybe restrain her, but he looked deeply uncomfortable himself, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him as if he couldn't quite bear to look at me or his wife. Marcus cleared his throat and tried his own approach, his voice carrying a note of reason, as if he could logic his way through this. Look, we could all benefit from this. Grandma wouldn't want us fighting. She'd want the family to stay together. I turned to look at him and felt a surge of something hot and bitter in my chest. Grandma wanted the family to stay together when she was alive, Marcus. She wanted visits and phone calls and to feel like she mattered to the people she'd raised and loved. Where was your concern about keeping the family together then? He had no answer for that, just sat there looking younger than his 35 years, and Emma tried again. We made mistakes, okay? We should have included you in the funeral. I know that was wrong, but you're not going to punish us forever, are you? You're not that kind of person. She was right that I wasn't that kind of person, but she was wrong about what this was. I'm not punishing anyone, Emma. Grandma made her choices based on how we all treated her. This isn't about revenge, it's about consequences. Patricia made a disgusted sound from her end of the table and muttered something under her breath that sounded like ungrateful and charity case. But my father put his hand on her arm, and for once she fell silent, and I could see him calculating too, trying to figure out if there was any angle left to work, any way to turn the situation to his advantage. The room had taken on a strange quality, everyone processing their own version of defeat, and I felt both powerful and exhausted, both vindicated and sad that it had come to this. I found myself standing without quite realizing I'd decided to stand, my chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through the tension in the room, and suddenly everyone was looking at me, and I realized I had something I needed to say. Something that had been building inside me through years of small humiliations and dismissals, and had finally reached a point where it could no longer be contained. Grandma knew exactly what she was doing. She saw who showed up, who cared, not who had the right last name or the biggest house, but who actually loved her. My voice was shaking at first, but it grew steadier with each word, stronger, fed by years of swallowed hurt and suppressed anger that was finally finding its way out. I sat with her every Tuesday evening for 5 years. Every single Tuesday without fail, no matter if I was tired from work or sick or dealing with my own problems. I brought her the butterscotch candies she loved, the ones from that little shop on Maple Street that she remembered from when she was young. I helped her when the nurses were too busy, when she needed someone to walk with her to the dining room, or adjust her pillows, or just hold her hand. I listened to the same stories about Grandpa 50 times because they made her happy, because I could see the light in her eyes when she talked about him, because I knew those memories were precious to her, and she needed someone who would treat them as precious too. I looked around the room at each of them in turn, really looked at them, and saw them all avoiding my gaze, except for my mother who was watching me with tears streaming down her face. Where were all of you? Where were you on those Tuesday evenings when she would wait by the window watching for visitors who never came? Where were you on her birthday last year when I was the only one who showed up? When she tried to pretend it didn't matter, but I could see how much it hurt her? Where were you during the holidays when she would ask about you, make excuses for why you were too busy, try to convince herself that you still cared? The silence that followed my questions was absolute and crushing, and I saw Marcus looking at his hands, saw Emma with tears on her cheeks that seemed different from her earlier angry crying, saw my father's jaw clench so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, and I felt something breaking open inside me, something that had been locked away and protected for so long that letting it out felt both terrifying and liberating. She kept track, you know. She wrote it all down. Every visit, every phone call, every time someone promised to come and didn't show up. She wasn't doing it to be petty or to punish anyone. She was doing it because she needed to see it clearly, to know that she wasn't imagining the distance, that her loneliness was real and justified. I could feel my whole body trembling now, but I couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. And none of you can meet my eyes right now except Mom, because you all know I'm telling the truth. My father was the one who made the last attempt to turn this around, his voice cutting through the silence with that authoritative tone he'd always used when he wanted to end an argument by sheer force of will. You're really going to destroy this family over money? After everything we've been through, you're going to let greed turn you into someone we don't recognize? The accusation hung in the air, and I felt something crystallize inside me, a clarity that cut through all the confusion and hurt and doubt. I'm not destroying anything, Dad. You all destroyed it years ago when you decided I wasn't good enough for you. When you made me feel worthless because I chose to help people instead of chase wealth. I turned to look directly at Emma, and I saw her flinch before I even spoke. You told me not to come to her funeral. Her funeral. The funeral of the woman who helped raise us, who loved us, who deserved to have everyone who cared about her there to say goodbye. You told me not to come because I'd embarrass you. Emma's tears were flowing freely now, and they looked different from before, less angry and more genuinely ashamed, and she opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out, and I wasn't finished. Grandma gave me this gift not just because I visited, not just because I showed up, but because she wanted me to know that someone valued who I am. Someone saw worth in the choices I made, in the life I built, in the person I decided to be, even when all of you made it clear that person wasn't good enough for this family. My voice was steady now, no longer shaking, and I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me even as I said these hard truths. She wanted me to know that choosing compassion over status, that choosing to help people over making money, that choosing meaning over appearances, that those choices had value, that I had value. And she knew I needed to hear that because every single one of you spent years telling me the opposite. I saw my mother's shoulders shaking with sobs, saw Marcus staring at his hands as if he couldn't bear to look at me, saw Patricia's mouth pressed into a thin line of fury, saw my father's face frozen in an expression I couldn't quite read. So no, I'm not going to apologize for accepting what Grandma wanted to give me. I'm not going to feel guilty for being the grandchild she could count on. And I'm not going to let any of you make me feel like I somehow manipulated or tricked a woman who was sharper at 87 than most people are at 50. The words kept coming, and I realized I'd been holding them back for years. Decades, maybe. All the hurt and dismissal and casual cruelty finally finding their way out. Grandma gave me this because she saw me, really saw me, and she decided that what she saw was worth honoring. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat, a sound that cut through the emotional thickness in the room and drew everyone's attention back to him, and he said in that calm, professional voice that somehow made everything he said feel weighted with importance. I should mention that Mrs. Matthews left one additional instruction. She requested that Sarah be given her personal journals, which document the past 5 years in detail, including every family interaction, every visit, every broken promise. He reached beneath the table and brought out 3 leather-bound books, each one thick and worn with handling, the kind of journals with actual paper and binding that spoke of something important enough to be recorded by hand. And he placed them carefully on the table in front of me. She wanted you to know you weren't imagining anything. She wanted you to have proof of everything you experienced, everything you remembered. My hands were trembling as I reached for the journals, and I could feel everyone in the room watching me, could sense the shift in energy as they realized what these books might contain, what evidence Grandma Rose had been quietly collecting all this time. I picked up the top journal, felt the weight of it in my hands, the leather smooth and cool against my palms, and I opened it to a random page somewhere in the middle, and there was Grandma's handwriting, that careful, precise script that had become shakier in recent years, but was still completely legible, still unmistakably hers. Sarah's 45th visit today. She brought photos of the family she helped get housing. Such light in her eyes when she talks about her work. Still haven't heard from Richard in 2 months. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, and I flipped to another page, unable to stop myself. Emma called today, asked if I could loan her $5,000 for new furniture. Didn't ask how I was doing. Sarah sent flowers for my birthday, arrived this morning with a card she made herself. Another page. Marcus stopped by with his fiancée, stayed 15 minutes, spent most of it looking at his phone. Sarah stayed 3 hours last Tuesday, helped me organize my photos, laughed at all my old stories even though she's heard them before. I looked up from the journal and saw my father's face had gone from red to pale, saw Emma staring at the journals with something like horror in her eyes, saw Marcus looking sick, and I understood suddenly why Grandma had kept these records, why she had documented everything so carefully. She knew you'd do this. She knew you'd try to make me doubt myself, try to make me feel guilty, try to convince everyone that I'd somehow manipulated her. My voice was steady despite the tears streaming down my face. She kept these journals so I'd have proof that I wasn't crazy, that everything I remembered really happened, that the hurt was real and justified. I held up the journal. 5 years of visits, 5 years of phone calls and broken promises, and casual dismissals, all written down in her own hand. She saw everything. She knew exactly who showed up and who didn't. Mr. Whitmore looked around the room at the shell-shocked faces and said in that same measured, professional tone that had carried us through this entire devastating afternoon, "I believe we've covered all the essential elements of Mrs. Matthews' will. Sarah, I'll need you to schedule an appointment with my office within the next 2 weeks to handle the paperwork and begin the transfer of assets." He began gathering the documents spread across the conference table, and I understood this was the signal that the meeting was officially over, that there was nothing more to be said or contested or argued, that Grandma's wishes had been made clear and would be honored regardless of how anyone in this room felt about them. The family began to stand slowly, reluctantly, like people waking from a nightmare, only to discover the nightmare was actually their reality. Patricia was the first to leave, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, and as she passed my chair, she leaned down close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume and muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "Ungrateful little parasite." I felt the words land like a physical blow, but I didn't respond, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch, and she swept out of the conference room with her head held high as if she were the wounded party in all of this. My father followed immediately after, not even glancing in my direction, his face carved from stone and his jaw so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, and I realized I might never speak to him again, that this might be the moment that severed whatever thin thread had still connected us. Emma was gathering her purse, and her husband Brad was already standing with his hand on the small of her back, ready to guide her out, when Marcus approached me with slow, uncertain steps. He stopped a few feet away, maintaining that careful distance, and said in a voice that was quieter than I'd ever heard from him, I'm sorry. About the funeral. About all of it. The words seemed genuine, seemed to cost him something to say, and I saw in his face something I hadn't seen in years. Actual remorse, actual recognition of the pain he'd been complicit in causing. I nodded slowly, acknowledging his apology but not quite accepting it, not quite ready to absolve him of years of going along with everyone else's cruelty just because it was easier than standing up for what was right. Thank you for saying that. It was all I could manage, all I could give him right now, and he seemed to understand that it was more than he deserved. He touched my shoulder briefly, awkwardly, then walked out. Emma was still there, hovering near the door, and after Brad whispered something to her and stepped into the hallway to give us privacy, she came back toward me with tears still streaking her, carefully applied makeup. I really am sorry about the funeral text, she said, and her voice was shaking in a way that seemed genuine rather than manipulative. That was cruel. It was one of the cruelest things I've ever done, and I knew it was wrong even when I was typing it. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw someone who had built her entire identity around being perfect, being admired, being envied, and who was now confronting the reality that none of that mattered as much as simple human decency. Yes, it was, I said quietly, and I didn't try to make it easier for her, didn't try to soften the truth of what she'd done. Emma nodded, accepting the judgment, and then she left too, leaving only my mother Linda and stepfather George standing near the windows. Linda approached me carefully, tentatively, as if afraid I might tell her to stay away, and when she spoke her voice was thick with emotion. Sarah, I failed you. I got so caught up in my new life, in trying to fit into George's world, in competing with Patricia and Richard's wealth, that I forgot what you needed, what you deserved. Your grandmother was a better woman than I am. I looked at my mother and saw in her face something I hadn't seen in years. Genuine vulnerability, genuine regret, not the performative kind that came out at family gatherings when someone needed to smooth over tension, but the real kind that came from actually confronting what she'd done and what she'd failed to do. I know, I said quietly, and I meant it. I could see that she understood the magnitude of how badly she'd failed me, how completely she'd abandoned me in favor of a lifestyle and a social circle that valued all the wrong things. George stepped forward then, his hands in his pockets, his expensive suit somehow looking less impressive in this moment of raw honesty, and he said in a voice that was surprisingly humble for a man who usually carried himself with such confidence, I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. Linda would mention the tension sometimes, but I didn't understand the extent of it, didn't understand how you were being treated at family events, how completely you'd been pushed aside. I'm sorry I didn't pay closer attention, didn't intervene when I should have. I nodded, appreciating his words even though part of me wanted to ask how he could have lived in the same family system for years and not noticed, how he could have attended the same holidays and gatherings and not seen what was happening right in front of him. But I also understood that people saw what they wanted to see, believed what was convenient to believe, and it was easier to think everything was fine than to confront uncomfortable truths. I appreciate you both saying this, I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it, that despite everything, I still had some capacity for forgiveness toward my mother, some small ember of hope that maybe this relationship could be salvaged in some form. But I need you to understand that I can't just pretend the last few years didn't happen. I can't just forget that you stood by while I was belittled and excluded and dismissed, that you chose your new social status over your daughter. Linda's eyes filled with fresh tears and she nodded. I know. I don't expect you to forget or to forgive me right away. I just want a chance, eventually, to try to rebuild something. Even if it's small. Even if it takes years. I thought about Grandma's journals sitting in front of me. Thought about 5 years of documented neglect and broken promises. Thought about all the Tuesday evenings I'd sat with Grandma while my mother was out at charity galas and country club dinners. And I felt the full weight of everything I'd lost and everything I'd gained. I need time, I said finally. And I was grateful that my voice came out steady and clear, that I could state my needs without apologizing for them or softening them to make someone else more comfortable. I need space to process all of this, to figure out what I want my life to look like now. But thank you for being honest. Thank you for not asking me for money or trying to negotiate a share of the inheritance. That means something. George nodded and took Linda's hand. We understand. You know how to reach us when you're ready, if you're ready. They walked toward the door together, and Linda paused to look back at me one more time. Your grandmother loved you so much, Sarah. She talked about you constantly, about how proud she was of the work you do, the person you are. She was right to be proud. Then they were gone, and I was alone in the conference room with Mr. Whitmore, who was organizing papers into neat folders. And I felt suddenly, overwhelmingly exhausted, as if I'd run a marathon or lived through a year in the space of a single afternoon. 3 months passed like a dream I was afraid to wake from, and in that time I settled Grandma Rose's estate with Mr. Whitmore's careful guidance, signed all the necessary documents, transferred accounts into my name, and slowly began to understand that this wasn't temporary, that the security and freedom Grandma had given me was real and permanent and mine. I kept the house at 847 Maple Drive, that beautiful Victorian with the wraparound porch and the garden that Grandma had tended for 40 years. And I moved out of my small apartment in the affordable neighborhood that my family had mocked, and into the home where I'd spent so many childhood afternoons learning to bake cookies and listening to stories about Grandpa. The garden had been neglected in the months since Grandma moved to the nursing home, overgrown and wild, but I saw the bones of beauty beneath the weeds, and I knew I could bring it back to life, the same way Grandma had brought me back to life, with her unwavering love and acceptance. I set up a scholarship fund for social work students in Grandma Rose's name, with a $500,000 endowment through the state university, and I worked with the financial board to ensure it would specifically support students from low-income backgrounds who wanted to work in community services, the ones who chose meaning over money just like I had, just like Grandma had valued. I donated $100,000 to Grandma's nursing home with specific instructions that it be used to upgrade their activities budget, to bring in more entertainment and art supplies and better quality food for the residents, because I remembered how Grandma's face had lit up on the rare occasions when they had live music or craft projects. I invested the rest wisely with the help of a financial advisor Mr. Whitmore recommended, someone who understood that I wasn't interested in aggressive returns or risky ventures, that I wanted security and stability, and the freedom to keep living my life on my own terms. I still worked my social work job at the community center because I genuinely loved it. Loved helping families navigate the impossible maze of social services. Loved seeing a mother's face when we found her emergency housing or got her kids into a better school district. But now I worked without the constant grinding stress of wondering how I'd pay my bills, or whether my car would finally die and leave me stranded. I established clear boundaries with my family, and I was surprised to discover that I had the strength to maintain them without guilt or apology. Linda visited sometimes, usually on Saturday afternoons, and we'd have tea on Grandma's porch and talk carefully about safe subjects, and slowly, incrementally, we were building something that wasn't quite the mother-daughter relationship I'd wanted as a child, but was honest and real in its own way. I saw Emma and Marcus occasionally at necessary family events, cordial but distant, and they seemed to have accepted that they'd lost any claim to closeness with me when they chose cruelty over compassion. My father never apologized, never acknowledged what he'd done or failed to do, and after weeks of waiting for some sign of remorse, I finally accepted that he was who he was, and I couldn't change him, could only control how much access I gave him to my life. Last Saturday, I spent the entire afternoon in Grandma's garden planting roses, my hands deep in the rich soil, and I felt her presence so strongly, it was almost like she was standing beside me, offering encouragement and advice the way she had when I was young and uncertain about everything. I finally understood that I was never the embarrassment, that there was nothing wrong with choosing a life of service and meaning, that my worth had never been determined by my income or my car or the size of my apartment, but by the compassion I showed and the love I gave freely without expecting anything in return. Grandma didn't leave me money to change who I am, I thought, as I patted soil around the roots of a yellow rose bush that reminded me of the ones that used to bloom by her front steps. She left it so I'd never doubt my worth again.